Hi everyone. Those were some sandhill cranes that we were enjoying flying over in central Texas. And I'm including a series of videos in this presentation today because I don't know what sort of day you've all had, and I want some time for us to be able to reflect and relax this morning. I'm here in Portland, Oregon, filming this. I haven't really been outside for the last week or so. Between COVID and the air quality being what it is, it's really been a pretty difficult time up here in the Pacific Northwest. And so hopefully you all are having better days in Arizona. But just in case, let's make sure we have a little bit of relaxation in here as well. But mostly, I think it's very cathartic to learn and to come together. So I'm jealous that you all get to be together, or we're spread out across the country in the state of Arizona. So let's go through and try to talk a little bit about wildlife and trees today. So I grew up in an unusual horticultural family. Trees were really very integral in my life. So here I am, doing a root excavation, playing around with trees when I was young. And this is some art that I drew when I was maybe 8 years old. Really, all of my art had trees in it and were very tree-centric as I was growing up. After graduate school, I joined Hort Science full-time. It was a small horticultural consulting company, mostly focused on tree preservation in the Bay Area. I did a lot of GIS mapping, a lot of field work and data analysis and those sorts of things, but eventually I started focusing on tree preservation and became a full consultant. I probably wrote somewhere between 300 and 500 arborist reports. Bartlett acquired Hort Science about 2.5 years ago, so I was part of what we call HBC, Hort Science Bartlett Consulting, and now am part of Bartlett Consulting as a consulting advisor, where I'm really working with our consultants all across the country and a little bit internationally on tree preservation and other consulting related projects. So I haven't worked yet in Arizona in this role and capacity, but I have a feeling I will relatively soon. I'd like to talk a little bit about my bird credentials. So my master's degree is in international nature conservation. And so I studied birds a little bit both in Germany and New Zealand while I was working on that program. I'm a master birder certified by the California Academy of Sciences. It was about a year-long program of classes and field trips and pretty intensive work, followed by another year of volunteer work. I volunteered with a wildlife rehabilitation hospital in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was really a great experience. I've been pretty focused on birds and really enjoying birding for the past 5 years or so now, and so I track through eBird my birding that I do all across the country and again a little bit internationally. And so I think you'll notice that I don't have any birds listed in Arizona, which is really unfortunate. I haven't made it there for a few years to be able to take that in, but I know it's a really great spot for birding. And I'm bummed to not be there in person because I would almost certainly have my binoculars in my bag and run out right after this to go try to find some hummingbirds. A few years ago, we started a little grassroots organization called Tree Care for Birds, so I was one of the founding members of that. And we were really just a group of arborists, biologists, wildlife conservationists who came together because we were interested in this sort of tree and bird issue. And so the main thing that I focused on was writing best management practices for wildlife for the tree care industry. We had debated what geographic area to use, right? So we talked about as small as Southern California and as large as international, and eventually settled on California would be our first iteration. And so now the Tree Care for Birds is a program of the Western chapter of the ISA. And so now we're expanding the BMPs to apply to Arizona, Nevada, and Hawaii as well. So I think you can already see the challenges in trying to write a single document that applies both to Arizona and to Hawaii. But we're working our way through that, and we actually have a draft appendix of the Arizona section already. And so we're working our way through that right now, and I expect in the next few months for a draft to come out for the comment period. So if anyone's interested in being involved in that or in commenting on the draft, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you and happy to connect you with our Arizona team. I think we have about 20 people working on it right now in Arizona. I do a lot of these types of presentations nowadays virtual. Prior to March, I was doing all of these in person. And so I think this is my 46th presentation on this sort of topic, trees and birds and how to bring them together and what we can be doing better as arborists. But I've also been enjoying focusing, getting more involved in the bird community, and they are generally hungry for tree knowledge, that they really like having arborists there that they can ask tree questions to. So I'll just encourage you all to, if you want to connect with your local wildlife sort of conservation organizations, the Audubons and whatever else you have out there, knowledge of trees is something that they're interested in and something that they'd probably like to connect with you about. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our next video, which is a pileated woodpecker drumming on a dead tree. This is sort of signaling its territory. It's a woodpecker's version of a song, which most songbirds sing to try to establish their territory. All right, I'd like to start a little bit talking about why wildlife are important to you all as arborists. Now, this is a hard topic for me to talk about because wildlife are just so important into my life that I just take it for granted that it's not that important to everyone else. And so we'll get into that in just a second, but first I wanted to talk about, we're going to talk a lot about birds today, and the best management practices talk a lot about birds. There's a variety of reasons for this, both sort of the law structure, the natural diversity of birds, and public opinion. People just really, really love birds for some reason, and I'm one of those people. I don't really understand why. So hopefully a lot of these practices apply generally to other wildlife. What else are we likely seeing out there? We're probably seeing bats and squirrels. We're probably seeing a lot of insects and all sorts of other types of wildlife that we could focus on as well. And if you have questions on this, we can get to that in the question and answer period, but largely we're going to talk about birds today. So, reasons why wildlife are important to you. Number one, they are declining. So worldwide, a World Wildlife Fund study from 2020, it just came out a couple of weeks ago, said that about 70% of wildlife populations have declined internationally across the globe. And that's really concerning, and it varies quite a bit in sort of region to region. So in Northern Europe, that was sort of the least decline, whereas in Central and South America it was the most decline. I think somewhere around 96%, which is crazy. That's such wildlife are being impacted so hard right now. And that's true in North America as well. So there was another paper that came out a couple of years ago looking at North American bird species. And so we can see here that based on habitat, not everyone declined, right? So wetland species have actually increased in numbers in the last 50 years, but in all other habitat types, they've decreased, and grasslands have been probably hit the hardest. Now, arborists are not responsible for all of this decline, but we've played our part, both in sort of directly impacting nests, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and maybe more so, I think the presumption is that a lot of this decline is related to habitat loss, and we certainly play our part in that, right? We are removing trees, we're removing vegetation. These are habitat, and that these are really integral pieces to these wildlife, and that we maybe could make sure that we're making responsible decisions around how much habitat we're removing when we're out there doing tree care. So just a little bit of a different way to sort of think about what we're doing when we're doing tree care. So second reason is that wildlife are really important to people, like I just said. So 86 million people watched wildlife, participated in a recreational activity that included wildlife watching in 2016. These are members of the public. These are our clients. These are people out there watching us and are really focused on wildlife and wanting to make sure that we're being responsible around them. Americans spent $76 billion in 2016 in order to enjoy wildlife, right? This likely includes people buying birdseed. I think I bought a pair of binoculars in 2016, so this would have included me as well. And so these people are out there, and I think we need to be cognizant of that. And I think in some places, maybe you can say, oh, that's important, out in these other areas, but not important here where I live and work. But I don't think you can say that in Arizona, because Arizona is sort of this natural bird hotspot, right? There's so many birds there, and so many birds there that we don't have very often in other parts of the country. So Arizona is really like a birding destination, and somewhere that people seek out to go and see great birds, hummingbirds in particular. And so I think that in Arizona we have to accept that, that wildlife are really important to people. And then lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about our industry documents, because wildlife have found their way into important industry documents that we're supposed to be following, so we want to make sure that we're doing that. So I'd like to start with the structure of how these documents are made for anyone who doesn't know. So the ANSI A300 standards are like the highest, right? They're the, they're going to be very broad, and they're going to give us, very short little snippets of like, this is what we should be doing. And then the ISA best management practices are going to be in the middle. They're going to give us much more details on how to accomplish those goals and do those things that were established in the standards. But they're still broad, right? They're going to be talking about a lot of things, so they can't focus very much on wildlife. So what we've done in our wildlife best management practices is try to provide a lot of the context and a lot more details around some of those suggestions that these other documents make. So first, in the ANSI A300 pruning standard, for the last couple of years, there's been an objective of manage wildlife habitat. So we can prune specifically for this objective now, which I think is a really great addition. There's also a heading cut exemption for conserving or creating wildlife habitat. And this came out first, so I think this confused a lot of people when it came out, but now luckily we have a lot more guidance both in our wildlife BMPs and in the ISA pruning BMPs, where basically what it says is if one of the objectives is to maintain or promote wildlife habitat, not all dead, dying, and decaying branches should be removed. And this would apply to full trees as well, but that wouldn't work in the pruning BMPs, right? We don't have a tree removal best management practice. So I think that in forestry for a long time, they have focused on the value of dead and dying trees, snags, and that's starting to work its way into urban forestry as well, right? One of the big differences in walking out in a natural forest and walking in an urban forest is the number of trees and the number of dead trees and the number of dead branches, and the amount of dead branches on the ground. I think that's really one of the main differences, and if we wanted to provide better habitat in an urban forest, maybe that would be a good way to do it. The ISA BMPs for pruning also say that in some cases branches can be intentionally wounded to encourage decay or create cavities intended for nesting. So this is a little bit more of a radical idea, but we'll talk about both of these ideas here in a little bit. I think that the risk BMP provides really great advice and is something that we should definitely be looking to if we're trying to add more dead and dying trees to our urban forests. It talks about balancing habitat and risk. It talks about considering the height and the targets that we're working with. It talks about monitoring these snags over time, these dead and dying trees over time, and to consider root decay profiles. We know a lot about individual species and trees in general, and how they compartmentalize decay in their roots. And this could be really useful information for how long we might expect a dead tree to stand or something like that. Then in our wildlife BMPs, we provide lots of examples and lots of clarification on some of these ideas. So we're going to dive into this in just a second, but first I thought we'd enjoy a little red-naped sapsucker that is nesting in a cavity in a quaking aspen. So check out, listen for the begging calls of the nestlings that are inside that cavity nest, and look for the parents to come and deliver some insects to them while they're begging for food, right? They're hungry. Okay, let's talk a little bit about balancing wildlife habitat and risk. So again, in our risk best management practices, it says that selection of suitable wildlife habitat trees must consider the tree's risk as well as its value to wildlife habitat. So I think that the best way to talk about this, we'll talk about trees in sort of different stages in life, right? Trees at the planting stage, in the care stage, and in the end of life stage. But let's start with the end of life stage when we're going to talk about mature trees and compare mature trees to young trees. So what value do mature trees bring that we can't replicate easily in another way, in particular with young trees? So often when we remove mature trees, we have a requirement to plant a young tree, or maybe we'll plant several young trees. But really, when we think about the habitat that these trees provide to our wildlife, no number of small trees is going to be able to replicate the value of one mature tree because of the variety of things that it provides. And so one component I want to explain about a little bit is about cavity nests. So cavity nesting wildlife are totally reliant on trees to complete their life cycle. They live inside of trees, they raise their young inside of trees. And so this is a good area to focus on because these are wildlife species that we know are totally reliant on trees. So woodpeckers are known as primary excavators, where they go in and they excavate out a cavity inside of the tree. And then there are several other species like our chickadees and our bluebirds and our nuthatches that go and live in those cavities after the woodpeckers have excavated them. And so we want to recognize the value that these trees have, that dead, dying, decayed, over mature trees have for these secondary cavity nesters. Because generally speaking, a woodpecker is going to excavate out a cavity every year and live in a different tree every year and leave behind those cavities for secondary cavity nesters. And that's a really great opportunity for us as arborists, because if we can preserve those cavities, we're going to have more secondary cavity nesters in our urban forests. And since we remove so many of those trees, we probably don't have very high numbers right now. So I don't have all the answers here for how wildlife value trees, but I have some ideas to share. And so let's start with mature trees and what we think are important about mature trees to wildlife. How would we gauge how they value them? So what we're going to look at here is we have a tree growing over time where it gets bigger and bigger, and then it sort of declines in health and eventually dies and falls over. So this is sort of the lifespan or life cycle of a tree. And how do wildlife value that tree change over time based on what stage this tree is in? And so the first thing that I think is important to consider in trying to determine how valuable a tree is for wildlife is its height. As a tree grows taller, there's just more opportunity and more habitat available for wildlife. So for example, with this red-tailed hawk, it has a nest very high up in this eucalyptus tree. If there was a smaller tree here or a younger tree here, it wouldn't have this nesting site available to it. So we can see that as trees grow taller, they provide better perch habitat, better nesting habitat, sometimes better forage or gleaning habitat, so that this height is really important. Over time, trees grow taller and taller and taller, and they stop growing taller as they decline or when they're dead, and eventually they fall over and lose all of that height. The next thing that I'd like to look at is diameter. So as trees grow in diameter, they become more valuable for a variety of reasons, but once again, let's focus on cavity nesting species because they're totally reliant on trees. In order to have a cavity, in order to be able to excavate a cavity inside of a branch or trunk of a tree, it probably has to be at least 8 inches. Maybe there's a few species that can work in smaller diameters than that. But that's a good idea anyways, is the larger the tree, the more space is available for this excavation, for this nest. And so when they come in there, the woodpeckers drill a quite small hole on the outside, and then a larger cavity on the inside where they can actually build that space. And that big space on the inside needs a pretty big tree in order to, or a pretty big branch, in order to be able to have enough space to be able to raise the chicks in there. So as a tree grows, it grows in diameter, and that seems to taper off as a tree gets mature. Doesn't grow in diameter at least as fast, at least because of the incremental change. And that dead tree eventually falls over, and that diameter is no longer being used except as down woody debris, which is also very important. The next one I think most arborists wouldn't immediately think of, and that's the importance of decay to wildlife in mature trees. So again, thinking about these cavity nesting species, we have a variety of species that are reliant totally on these cavity nests, and that they're quite difficult to excavate inside a tree, right? We all know that trees are hard and strong, and that that's one of its main features. So for a woodpecker that's looking to excavate a tree and that won't take as long, what they would like is to find a tree with heart rot, where it has the intact sapwood and drills a small hole through the intact sapwood, reaches the decayed heart rot, and can excavate a large cavity in that heart rot. So these are really beneficial trees to woodpeckers, and woodpeckers seem to be able to select trees that have heart rot and drill into them to make their life easier. Obviously, there's a variety of species that also use natural cavities, which have just been excavated by decay naturally over time. Acorn woodpeckers use dead and dying trees and decayed trees for granaries, and all sorts of insects also use these decayed areas to be able to keep these insect populations high, which are so important to wildlife. Insects, there are a variety of wildlife that eat insects all year round, but basically every baby bird eats insects during that nesting period. And so having an abundance of insects during that period is really important to wildlife in our urban forests. Decay doesn't come around in young trees very often, right? So decay happens sort of later in life, and we would expect to see decay increase as a tree declines, sort of be quite high when a tree is standing and dead, and really continue to be quite high as it's a log on the ground, as it's down woody debris. It wouldn't be as useful there for cavity nesting species, but it might be useful for a lot of reptiles, a lot of insects, and other decay as down woody debris on the ground. Then I'd like to talk about the importance of a complex three-dimensional structure. When I think of mature trees, this is really what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of epiphytes. I'm thinking of probably what we would call defects in most arboriculture, right? These just complicated, weird structures where we've created a new habitat up in the tree. These are so difficult to replicate, and something that we should be really cognizant of and consider not removing these types of features when we have them in our urban forests. This complexity builds up over time, and I think gets even more complex when it's on the ground. I think this complex structure of down woody debris would be a really easy thing to bring into our urban forests in ways that we could do a lot to benefit wildlife in that way without adding a lot of risk to our community. So all of these graphs I just made up. There's no data behind these. I would love for there to be some data that I could base some of this on. But if you add these graphs up, I would say that wildlife value trees that are in the sort of dead to dying range, that this is where wildlife sort of most value trees. And that if you were to compare that with how humans value trees, we really give the most value to these really high vigor, healthy, mature trees, that those are most valuable to humans. And if you compare how wildlife and how humans value trees, we're probably undervaluing the over-mature, dead and dying trees, and overvaluing the young, recently planted, rapidly growing trees. And so I think that's an interesting idea, right? That we could start valuing these over-mature trees a little bit more, and that might be really beneficial to wildlife if we can find some ways to preserve more in our urban forest. Now, I'll just give a little caveat of, I'm not totally certain that that's true, right? is a dead tree really more valuable to wildlife than a living tree? But what I am sure about is that we remove those trees all the time. So we don't have a very large population of dead trees in our urban forest. And because of that, we're limited in what we can provide with those. And so if we had more dead trees in our urban forest, I think that we would be less limited and we would find that we would have more wildlife in our urban forests. So now I'd like to introduce a Bewick's wren. This Bewick's wren is going to be gleaning for insects in a coast redwood. So it's going to be hunting around in the leaves, trying to grab little insects off the leaves, and it seems to have found a spider. Okay, so if we accept that dead, dying trees, over mature trees, have a high value for wildlife, the next step is we're going to figure out how to preserve them, right? We don't want to just go out and preserve every dead tree out there. That would be crazy, right? We would be exceeding our risk thresholds all over the place. So what we want to do is we want to be smart about it. And our tree risk assessment BMPs says we want to balance risk and wildlife habitat. So we're going to go through a little example here. And in this example, we're going to do a full level 2 risk. So that means we've gone through the 2 matrices and we've established what the tree risk is. We're going to compare that with the risk tolerance and offer mitigation. I think that we can be a little cavalier in the tree care industry about using the words hazard and risk sort of just loosely, and that I'm going to use it very specifically here, and I think that that would be really beneficial to our industry if we tightened up a little bit how we use our risk language. So in this tree here, we've been asked by the property owner to come out and do a risk assessment, and we've determined that the risk of this branch failure exceeds the risk threshold of our property owner. So our next step is we want to offer some mitigation for that. Now, often, I think we would be recommending wholesale removal of this tree. And maybe we've already talked about that with our property owner and said, hey, this seems to be a valuable tree to us. We really like it. We understand that it's not the healthiest tree ever, but we'd like to try to keep it. Can we do that? And so the next thing we want to do is start looking at our mitigation. And typically what we would recommend are reduction cuts and removal cuts. And so we say, hey, the reduction cut probably won't reduce the risk enough. So what we would need to do is do a removal cut. And maybe our property owner says, oh, but I had bluebirds living in that cavity last year. I would love for them to come back next year. Is there any way that we can preserve that? And the answer is absolutely, we can preserve that. I think a heading cut is the right cut in this situation. And there are times when we should be using heading cuts to meet particular purposes such as we have right here. So we've done this heading cut and we've managed to reduce our risk while keeping our habitat available. And we can, not everyone wants this in their backyard, but I think some do. And so maybe what we've done is we've set up an agreement to come back in a couple of years, come back next year, come back in 6 months, whatever it is. And we say, hey, this tree's continued to decline, maybe we need to remove a little more. And oh, it's continuing to decline. We come back a year later and we remove a little more. Again, not everyone wants this in their backyard, but I'm sure some of you have clients who do want wildlife habitat snags in their yard. And that as arborists, that's a service that we could provide and something that we could provide and have the benefit of helping wildlife along the way. So we'll see these like really sharp, hard cuts, right? So like we followed our best management practices that says no jagged cuts. But maybe that's not what's best for wildlife. If you look at, failures out in the forest or in the urban forest, they often have this sort of splayed, broken look. And that's something that people have figured out how to mimic with a chainsaw. So typically we call this a coronet cut, where you're going to use your chainsaw to sort of aesthetically create a broken top look as if this tree naturally failed. Now I'd say that this is mostly aesthetic, but it also adds a textural element, which allows a little bit more fungal decay to get inside, create a little more complicated three-dimensional structure, and build that up so that we have something that's a little bit different out there when those flat tops can really take a long time to develop and something that we don't see in sort of the natural world. So here are a class that Brian French and I taught in Seattle, where he's training people in sort of the exact saw cuts that he uses to create these coronet tops, and that I think that they end up with a really beautiful, interesting feature of our urban forests. So this is a little crazy, right, of trying to preserve snags in different areas. Not everywhere is doing that very well. That's actually something the Pacific Northwest has excelled in, and people like Tim Brown and Julian Dunster have been doing this for decades and doing an amazing job at it, and so we've really relied on a lot of the progress that they've built up and are really thankful to them. But a lot of people in the Pacific Northwest are doing this very successfully, and I see snags all the time driving around in the Portland, Seattle areas, other areas in the Pacific Northwest. And so anyone who thinks this is crazy, it's something that I think we're going to see more of in urban forestry. I don't know that for sure. I certainly haven't seen much of it in California, but I have seen it starting to grow in California as well. And so if you think that's crazy, let's continue and talk about some really crazy things. So I'm sure you've all seen nest boxes up, and nest boxes are really designed to mimic cavities for secondary cavity nesters, right? So the ideal scenario is that we're able to preserve more dead and dying trees, and that because of that, we don't need nest boxes, right? We have enough cavities available out there that all the chickadees and bluebirds are happy using those cavities. And when we don't have enough of those cavities, that's when nest boxes are important to try to keep those population levels up until more trees can sort of decline and we have that in our urban forest. Now, nest boxes, people have some concerns about them. I don't know how. They're certainly not great aesthetically, and some people have concerns that that wildlife are going to identify home as a box that we've created, rather than a hole in a tree as they've evolved to prefer. And so what we've started doing is bringing some forestry practices into the urban forestry realm, where we're creating these cavities using chainsaw cuts to create these secondary cavity nesting opportunities. And this is something that we can add to a snag as we're managing or creating a snag in an urban forest setting to try to create some of these cavities. Now, this isn't something that you should just jump in and try. Feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it, set you up with some resources. A good idea is to go online and look up what the nest box properties are of the wildlife that you're trying to encourage, trying to create habitat for. Just know that these are very specific, that in terms of orientation, height, the size of the hole, the distance between the bottom and the top, everything is very, very specific. So we want to be pretty careful about not just creating these and hoping something shows up, but trying to create it for something. So if you're not sure of what sort of situation you might be able to offer a snag in these balancing risk and habitat scenarios, I'll show you one that I'm sure happens everywhere, every day, right? In every state in our country, every day this tree is being removed because, especially in California, where I've spent the majority of my career, we have such a concern about utilities starting fires right now. And so this tree is getting removed all day, every day. And there's opportunities, not every time, but in certain situations, to be able to create a wildlife habitat snag here. And I think that this is a really great example of something that we could start trying to target and trying to see, hey, this looks like an opportunity for a snag. Another thing that I think is important, we had an entire hour-long discussion about this in the Pacific Northwest ISA the other day, is wildlife habitat snag signs. And so being able to put a sign on the snag does a couple of things. I think the main thing it does is convey sort of responsibility and intentionality. So here I have two examples of signs which came from the Cavity Conservation Initiative in Southern California and Arboriculture International here in Portland, Oregon. But I've designed a sign myself, and there's a variety of other signs out there. Feel free to experiment and take a look around. But here I want to show you a couple of trees that have been topped. They've both been topped. They both have signs on them. But as I approach them and I can read these signs a little better, I can see that one of them was done on purpose, and I have a lot of faith and understanding that somebody professionally did this, on purpose. And on one of these, we have probably just a poorly managed tree that's being topped. And so I think a sign can do a lot to convey information, bring an audience in that we wouldn't necessarily expect. So I wasn't sold on this dead trees are really important in urban forestry for wildlife idea when I heard about it, 8 years ago. But I've been seeing it all over the world. It's been really surprising to see all these independent organizations come to the same conclusion. I've seen it in Southern California, the Pacific Northwest, on the East Coast, in Australia, and in Germany. Everybody seems to be coming to the same conclusion of how important this is. So I'm not sure exactly how it works in Arizona or whether this is right for you, but I can tell you that it does seem to be important in lots of other places of the world, and I'd like to encourage you to start thinking about it. But most importantly, let's remember that eventually these trees are likely going to need to be removed, and we should be monitoring them over time. So keep an eye on them, set up a plan for how you're going to monitor them with your property owner, with your client, with whoever's interested in that. And have a plan to remove them. Make sure that it doesn't get too unstable and that we're putting ourselves in a risky situation because of something we created. I would hate to see that. Okay, so let's watch a little video of an Anna's hummingbird building a nest and caring for its chicks. Okay, so here we have an Anna's hummingbird who's collected some lichen and is now working it down to sort of pack it into the nest. This is in a glossy privet tree, so the leaves are maybe 3 inches long, and it's about probably 12 or 15 feet off the ground. I took this video through the window of my office. It was working right outside of where I was working. Safe to say I did not get a lot done these couple of weeks where I got to watch it. So now it's much further along in the nest and sort of trying to clean up the outside. And now it's totally decorated the nest with lichen to try to hide it, and sitting on eggs. Right now it's incubating those eggs underneath it. Now we've got the young poking their head out, pretty cute, and saying, "Hey mom, I'm hungry, I want some food." And by the way, this is in a female Anna's hummingbird that is doing all the work here. The males really are not involved very much for Anna's hummingbirds. So here comes mom. She probably has some insects here that she picked off of plants all around and is going to feed them to the young. And that's the story of the Anna's hummingbird. Okay, so I think that we've covered enough of our mature trees and covering risk and balancing wildlife habitat. Let's talk about some other phases of tree growth, the tree care phase and the planting phase. So I think that the main thing we want to do in urban areas is plant more trees. There was a really interesting paper that just came out of the Wood Lab in Los Angeles, basically showing the correlation between income, canopy coverage, and wildlife. I don't think it's any real surprise that in low-income neighborhoods there was less canopy coverage and fewer birds, and in high-income areas there was more canopy coverage and more birds. For anyone not familiar with this sort of environmental justice aspects of urban forestry, I highly recommend this Davey webinar called Integrating Environmental Justice into Urban Forest Master Plans. It's probably the best webinar I saw this year. But what they talked about in this Wood paper is the species preference of these individual birds, right? Based on what they were seeing in the field. So one of their findings was that native trees are better habitat overall than non-native trees. And I think that that's a really great, interesting finding because they were only looking at street trees, so it was very comparable to one another. Another thing that they found is really high variability in how much birds were using the different species of non-native trees. So I was really surprised to find that southern magnolia was really bad habitat, whereas Chinese elm was really good habitat. I can't really see much reason why that would be the case. But I think that potentially we have the same answer for both native and this sort of variable response, which is insects. So Doug Tallamy is a professor on the East Coast who studies insects and the Carolina chickadee. And what he finds is that the Carolina chickadee spends more time in native plant areas, not because they're using those native trees, but because they're relying on the insects and that the insects prefer native trees. And so that might be the relationship that explains the whole thing and why we see variable populations of birds using different tree species. Insects may be the answer to that. And I see a lot of native oaks being planted in California right now on a lot of my projects. And I think that that's a great thing, but I also have some concerns that maybe we're planting too many oaks where we're becoming over-reliant on just a couple of species. So I'd like for us to try to balance this species diversity in our urban forests along with planting more native trees. So let's move on to the tree care phase. So once we've planted the trees, we want to be caring for them, and we know how important it is to care for young trees. They need irrigation, they need pruning, they need inspections, and that we do a pretty good job of this, I think. I was at a wildlife conference last year where basically a whole line of people were presenting on these different species, and they would say, I studied this bird, we built a model, it showed that tree canopy coverage is very important, so plant more trees. And so I think that we could embrace that canopy coverage is really important to our urban wildlife, and that anything we can do to sort of grow our canopy coverage, it's going to help the people, it's going to help the wildlife. And so following our best management practices, pruning, irrigation, going to be very important. What's maybe even more important than that is integrated pest management. So if insects are the link and what's really important about our tree species selection and things like that, we want to make sure that we're managing pests in a way that allow our urban forest to grow, but that still keeps a robust insect community available for our wildlife that are reliant on them in these urban areas. Okay, one more specific thing is palm trees. I think that palms are really important wildlife habitat in Arizona. That's something I keep hearing. And that is certainly true in Southern California and probably throughout California as well. And palms come in a variety of different shapes and sizes and things, but probably the most important aspect of a palm is its skirt. And palms that have that full skirt or even half skirt are almost certainly much better wildlife habitat than most of the other palms. So if you're working in an area with these palms, maybe you're removing the skirt or just working to remove the whole tree, I think we also want to be cognizant of nesting wildlife and our potential impacts on that. So the best management practices can be downloaded at treecareforbirds.com, and I spent a whole workshop last month about sort of more this minimizing impact side, but I want to make sure that we just touch on it in case anyone hasn't heard any of this before. So the most important aspects of this are, if you find a nest with young or eggs in it, I suggest that you stop working and give them time to leave the nest. If ultimately the person who impacts the nest, who's up in the tree, is most likely to be held responsible. So we really want to make sure we get these messages all the way out to the people who are out there climbing trees and making difficult decisions in the field. And you can find nesting wildlife anywhere, anytime, but there are definitely times and places where you're more likely to find nesting wildlife. And so in the best management practices, we call these times the breeding season, and we call these places habitat value. So where you are, most arborists in Arizona are working at elevations below 3,000 feet, in which case we think that the main breeding season is from the 15th of January to the 30th of June. If you're working in areas at higher elevations, we can shift that breeding season depending on how high you are. And our sensitive habitats, where we're most likely to find nesting wildlife, are probably riparian areas, nature areas, things like that. Maybe our high-value habitats are not quite as likely to find nesting wildlife. Maybe they're on the outskirts of town. Maybe they're well cared for urban parks that are managed for wildlife habitat and things like that. And then maybe our low habitat value areas, the areas where I think we're mostly working in, are areas with a lot of impervious surfaces, with a lot of sort of human impact and disturbance around it. So once we've determined how likely we are to find nesting wildlife, the next step that we do is a pre-work inspection. And this is really our best tool in order to try to minimize our impact towards wildlife. So getting out there and looking for wildlife, looking for nests, looking for signs of nesting wildlife is super important and something that we could all be doing better job of in the tree care industry. In Arizona, we've built a pre-work inspection form for you all to start using. So we've got a link to that here, and we'll be able to share that with you all. I think there'll be some changes to this, but I'm pretty excited about it, so go ahead and try it and start using it, and check out the best management practices as well. Well, that's all the time I have for today, so at this point I'm going to leave you with a white-breasted nuthatch exploring an oak tree.